Okay, so life, right. It's like sometimes it's smooth sailing, everything's going great, and then bam. Out of nowhere, curveball. It can be anything, like a sudden health scare, or maybe things just go sideways at work, or even, like a global pandemic. You sent us some really interesting stuff to dig into, The Learner, all about how we deal with these curveballs, these moments where things just feel so incredibly unfair.
Yeah, and I think, when you look at all the material you sent, the question of fairness really jumps out. Like, how do we cope, not just practically, but mentally and emotionally, when life throws us something that feels profoundly unreasonable?
Right. Like, how do we not just survive it, but actually come out the other side? I don't know, maybe even stronger. That's what we're going to explore today. And to help us do that, we're going to be diving deep into the work of Ichiro Kishimi.
Exactly, and specifically his book, The Courage of Anger. Don't let the title throw you off, though. This isn't about, like, flying off the handle. It's about understanding and channeling that feeling of this isn't right that we all get when life throws us a curveball.
So we're talking about how to navigate life's unfairness, and this is like a crash course in how to do it, right? Using Kishimi's insights. The Learner, if you've ever felt overwhelmed by these kinds of situations, this one's for you.
Definitely. And we're not just going to be, regurgitating Kishimi's ideas.
Yeah.
We're going to really dig into them, see how they apply to the real world, the kinds of challenges that we all face. So we'll be looking at how he distinguishes between the unavoidable and the potentially preventable, the different ways we tend to react when things feel unjust, and most importantly, how to develop more constructive responses instead of just getting swallowed up by negativity.
And Kishimi brings such a fascinating mix of perspectives to all of this. He draws on philosophy, his own personal experiences. He had a pretty serious heart attack at 50, which I'm sure had a huge impact on how he views life and its unexpected turns, and even his observations on major world events like the COVID pandemic and the postponement of the Tokyo Olympics. So it's a pretty comprehensive look at, I don't know, how do we make sense of things when they don't make sense?
That's really the core question, isn't it? How do we stay grounded, rational even, when life throws something at us that feels utterly, deeply unreasonable? That gut feeling of, this just isn't right. That's really the starting point for everything Kishimi wants to explore.
Okay, so let's unpack that. And one of the first things Kishimi does is make this really fundamental distinction, the separation between what's unavoidable and what might actually be preventable. Like natural laws, the kind of stuff we just can't escape, right? Like getting older, illness, and eventually, death. It's not pleasant to think about, but it's part of the human experience.
Absolutely. And then there are the things that happen, the difficulties, the tragedies that stem from human actions or maybe inaction. Think about like medical errors or situations where maybe there wasn't enough preparation for a natural disaster. He even talks about how governments handled or maybe mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. So, where the difficulty comes from plays a huge role in how we process it.
Yeah, for sure. And then he brings up this ancient Greek concept, huraios. What's the deal with that?
So Trios, it's interesting. It literally meant seasonable, like the right time for something to happen in nature. So like the appropriate time for flowers to bloom or when crops should be harvested. But it also carried this sense of what was right and proper just in human affairs as well. So when something disrupts this natural order, like a death that feels too early or disaster that could have been prevented, that feels deeply out of season, like wrong on a fundamental level. And Kishimi actually uses this very striking image. He talks about perfectly blooming flowers that were supposed to be used for the Tokyo Olympics being cut down because the games got postponed. It's like this beautiful thing, pointlessly destroyed. It feels so out of sync, so untimely. So I guess one of the takeaways here is that our sense of injustice, a lot of times it's rooted in this feeling that the natural order, this sense of fairness, has been violated.
Yeah, that's a powerful image. And then, he talks about death itself and I don't know, it's such a complicated relationship we have with it. Even when a death is, quote unquote, timely, like someone dies of old age, it's still so hard for those left behind to come to terms with it.
Yeah, it's this profound loss no matter what. And then when death comes unexpectedly, especially for someone young, through illness or an accident, that feeling of it being unreasonable, it's amplified so much. It feels like such a deep injustice, like a life was cut short before its time. And Kishimi points out the anger and resentment that can come up. Sometimes it's even directed at something impersonal, like a virus, right? There's this questioning, this why this person, why now? It's so hard to grapple with.
It really is. And then he gets into this really crucial area, which is who is responsible when a death feels unacceptable. Like deaths from natural disasters, those are tragic, but we sort of reluctantly accept them, right? It's nature, it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
But when it's negligence, when it's human-created risks that contribute to death, that's a whole different story. He brings up accidents at nuclear power plants as a prime example. The deaths that result from something like that, they just feel so unjust because they weren't simply an act of nature, you know?
Right, there's this sense of responsibility, of accountability. And Kishimi also brings up those really tragic examples of people who commit suicide in shelters after disasters. These deaths, they're not directly caused by the disaster itself, but they can feel like a consequence of, insufficient support, inadequate planning. And then there are deaths resulting from accidents or crime, where there's this heavy weight of could it have been prevented. He even mentions Martin Buber, the philosopher, and his just profound outrage at the Holocaust, like a deep questioning of his faith in the face of such immense human-caused evil. It really underscores how heavy these questions become, emotionally, philosophically, when death feels both avoidable and unjust.
Yeah, it's like, how do you even begin to process that? Okay, so we've talked about life throwing these truly unreasonable situations at us, some we can't avoid and some that maybe, hopefully, we could prevent. So Kishimi then moves on to explore how we typically react to these situations, our sort of knee-jerk responses. And the first one he talks about is, and this might sound a little strange, doing nothing.
Yeah, at first glance, it doesn't sound like much of a strategy, does it? But Kishimi makes the point that it's actually a very common way we cope with the unreasonable. He acknowledges that acceptance can be part of healing, but simply doing nothing, well, that doesn't really lead to change, does it? He uses this example of the philosopher Tanaka Michitaro during the Great Kanto earthquake, who said he felt like blank, not philosophical. It was just this stunned inaction in the face of such an overwhelming event. I think the takeaway here is that these initial reactions, they're natural, but they often don't really address the core issues, the unfairness that's at the heart of these situations.
And he ties this into what we often call like the victim mentality, right? That why me feeling. And it can manifest in different ways, anger, resignation. But even when we don't do anything outwardly, there's still emotions there, like despair, depression. He makes this really interesting point about children crying to signal their needs. It's a form of an action, but it's meant to trigger a response, right?
Right. It's communication, even if it's nonverbal. And what's interesting is Kishimi's observation that, well, adults do this too sometimes. We rely solely on inaction, hoping that it will somehow manipulate others or get us the help we need. He even talks about this idea that, ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. Closing your eyes to something scary doesn't mean it's not there anymore.
Yeah.
And then he brings up this danger of complacency, especially when we're dealing with predictable disasters or ongoing crises like a pandemic. He mentions this observation by Yoko Tawada about Japan, seemingly just passively waiting for the pandemic to end. It's a powerful image, this sort of collective inaction.
It is. Okay, so that's doing nothing. The second approach he discusses is adapting to the environment. So this is about, I guess, changing ourselves to accept what's happened, finding some kind of meaning, even in really unreasonable events, like that saying, nothing in life is wasted.
Right, it's about resilience, finding a way to move forward. And in our relationships, it can mean choosing to give people the benefit of the doubt. When it comes to natural disasters, the things we can't prevent, it's about minimizing the harm through preparation and learning to live with the aftermath.
But he also points out that this approach, this just change myself mentality, it has its limits. It might not address larger systemic problems or real injustice. He asks this really important question. Can you truly live well under a corrupt government simply by trying to find a positive spin on it all? There's only so much individual adaptation can do, right? Especially when it comes to broader societal failures.
Exactly. And that brings us to the third approach he talks about, changing the world. So this is the more proactive stance, directly tackling the problem head on. And Kishimi uses this great example of Adler, his ambition to eliminate death by becoming a doctor. It's this very human drive, this desire to change what seems unchangeable.
And we see the same drive today, right? Like with all the efforts to fight COVID-19, the development of vaccines and treatments, all the preventative measures. But Kishimi is also quick to point out the limitations here. Like we can't actually conquer death. And even when we do manage to create change, like with something like organ transplants, it's hard to say definitively whether that change is always 100% good.
And he also looks at our attempts to change others in our personal lives, like parents scolding children or bosses reprimanding employees. It often doesn't really work the way we hope, right? Like it can be met with resistance or maybe you get compliance on the surface, but not a real change of heart. He even brings back the example of kids using crying or tantrums to manipulate their parents and points out that, well, as adults, we need to find more effective ways to communicate than just anger. And then there's the reality that, even when you have the best intentions to improve a relationship, the other person might not be ready or willing to change in the way you'd like them to.
It's so true. Relationships are complicated.
Okay.
Okay, so he lays out these 3 common reactions, these initial ways we tend to respond to unreasonable situations. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on to suggest some more nuanced ways of engaging with these challenges. And one of them is not assigning meaning to events. Now, that sounds a little counterintuitive, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But what Kishimi's getting at is, well, maybe try seeing events as just neutral occurrences without immediately layering on all our judgments and interpretations, like he talks about illness or aging. Instead of seeing them as inherently bad, as degeneration, maybe we can simply view them as changes. It's a subtle shift, but it has the potential to lighten the emotional load we attach to these inevitable parts of life.
That's interesting. And he also revisits the idea of changing the world, but he makes this important distinction between trying to make things better for everyone versus manipulating things just for personal gain. And he even questions the inherent value of complete self-sacrifice for a cause. Is it truly sustainable? Is it always the best approach?
Yeah, he's pushing us to think critically. And then when it comes to adapting, he cautions that it can easily morph into self-blame, or forcing ourselves to see the positive in situations that are actually harmful. He also points out the resentment that can build when we adjust our expectations, but others don't reciprocate. So the key here is to move beyond just a purely self-centered perspective.
And then there's his take on optimism, which is, well, kind of surprisingly critical. He brings up Viktor Frankl and his observation that there were actually higher death rates in concentration camps around holidays, the idea being that dashed hopes can lead to deeper despair. And then there's Thucydides, who wrote about the Athenian plague and how realizing you were sick, it had this incredibly demoralizing effect. So unfulfilled optimism, it can actually make things worse.
Right, it's like setting yourself up for disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
And this kind of sets the stage for Kishimi's own stance, which he articulates as this need to actually say, this isn't right, in order to bring about real change. He acknowledges that we can't change what's already happened, like aging, death, natural disasters. But acceptance, it does come with time, especially when we see that efforts are being made to help those who are affected.
But he's really focused on those human-caused, unreasonable difficulties, the preventable deaths due to negligence, the lack of access to healthcare, the failures in government response. And he's adamant that we can't just chalk these things up to fate.
Accountability is key here. Kishimi specifically talks about the importance of holding people and institutions responsible for medical malpractice. And he cautions against apathy towards, those larger societal issues like politics. Bad governance, it has very real consequences. He uses this great analogy. He compares it to a house on fire. Doing nothing, it just lets the fire spread.
That's a great analogy, and it leads to this really powerful statement. Silence in the face of injustice implies agreement. Kishimi's firm on this. Real change. It requires us to speak up when something is wrong.
And this brings us to what Kishimi calls the illusion of atmosphere. It's those unspoken pressures, the expectations that often keep us quiet, even when we know something isn't right. And he uses these Japanese terms, e, gen, nat, which means words like pronouncements, and shoku, meaning appearance or demeanor, to describe this.
And he asks this really important question. Why do we so often stay silent even when that little voice inside is telling us, hey, something's off here? It's kind of like the bystander effect, right? And he even reflects on his own experience in high school. A teacher actually said that as civil servants, they couldn't disobey their superiors, even if those superiors were corrupt. It's like, wow.
It really makes you think. And then he connects this to the idea of reading the air, which in Japanese is tadako, satsukin kanshoku. It's this deep-seated practice, trying to anticipate unspoken expectations, especially from those in positions of authority. And he gives this very relatable example. Think about students in a classroom. They might have genuine questions, but they hesitate to ask right before class ends because they can sense that everyone just wants to leave.
Oh, yeah, totally. It's like this unspoken agreement. And this atmosphere, it's such a weird thing because it doesn't have a physical form, right? It's not like someone explicitly says, don't ask questions, we all want to go. But its influence is so strong. He even brings up Bian's concept of new, which is like this faceless pressure to conform.
Right, it's this feeling, this pressure you can't quite pinpoint. And this fear of going against the grain, of disrupting the perceived atmosphere, it often leads us to choose inaction over action. It just feels safer to stay silent, than to potentially rock the boat or face disapproval.
And this is where he goes deeper into this idea of dialogue and this concept of ba, which means place or field. He breaks down dialogue into its basic parts, the I, the you, and the thing, the subject of the conversation. But then he adds this fourth element, us.
And he's drawing on the work of Nakaoka Shigemasa, who described us as being like a magnetic field, this force that shapes how the dialogue unfolds. So it's not just about the individual speaking, but the environment they're in, those unspoken dynamics between them. Think about the feeling you get in a meeting where there's a lot of tension. Yeah. That's kind of like the us at play.
Yeah, I get that. And then he brings up Kimura and his concept of suishin, which is this betweenness, the space between people. And Kimura had this idea that us can almost have its own will, that groups are shaped by it and act within it. It's almost like the social environment itself becomes an active participant in the interaction.
It's a really interesting idea. But Kishimi does offer a critique of this idea of us acting independently. He argues that ultimately it's individuals who act under its influence, not the us itself. He makes this helpful analogy. Think about an orchestra. The individual musicians are the ones playing their instruments. It's not the abstract concept of the orchestra that's making the music.
Makes sense. And then this brings up the question of individual versus group subjectivity. Like, Kimura seemed to think that species autonomy was more powerful than individual autonomy. He uses the example of birds flocking together, how they move as one unit.
Yeah, and that raises these really deep questions about our sense of free will. Like, is what we perceive as individual choice maybe actually driven by a more unconscious species autonomy? It's pretty mind-blowing. Kishimi talks about the influence of Nishida Kitaro and Imanishi Kinji, who emphasized the species as being the primary unit of evolution, with whole species changing together in these sometimes mysterious synchronized ways.
And Imanishi's is principle, this idea that the individual is the species and the species is the individual, that's a really hard one to wrap your head around. Kimura had a more nuanced view, but Kishimi does point out the potential for misunderstanding here. If the species is seen as the true agent of change, then individuals are sort of just along for the ride.
Right, and this leads to a crucial point, which is the potential dangers of personifying space, or ius. These concepts, they can feel so real, almost tangible. But if we start attributing causal power to them, well, it can actually hinder genuine dialogue.
So how do we make sure that doesn't happen?
Well, Kishimi talks about Kimura's idea of this directly felt pre-logical space that exists between people. It's not about words. It's more like a common feeling, a shared mood that influences behavior. Even without explicit communication, it's that sense you get when you walk into a room and you can just feel the atmosphere.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. But this emphasis on sensing and conforming to the eyes, it can be a problem because it can stifle open and honest communication. We can become so focused on not disrupting this perceived atmosphere that self-censorship becomes the default. So silence wins out, not because we necessarily agree, but because we're afraid of the potential consequences of speaking up. And this is where he gets into this idea that this space in a conversation, it's not something that just exists naturally in some fixed way. It's actually constructed by us through our interactions. And he tells this really interesting story about Rudolf de Gruyter's, who went to Alfred Adler for advice about a patient who had been diagnosed with depression.
Yeah, and what's so insightful about this story is that Adler, he starts asking the patient a rapid-fire series of questions, and it actually disrupts the patient's slow, deliberate speech pattern. And it turns out that this slowness, it wasn't just a symptom of the depression itself. It was also a way the patient was maybe unconsciously controlling the conversation.
So it's not just about the cause of behavior, but also the purpose behind it, right? Like, what is it achieving? Kishimi points out that Adler looked at the moku, which means purpose or aim, rather than just the isen, the cause or origin of the behavior. And he gives another example, this time of a woman who's very talkative, and her rapid speech, it serves the purpose of preventing others from interjecting.
And he even mentions a story by Balzac about a merchant who stuttered, but he used his pauses strategically to actually gain an advantage in negotiations. So what Adler was doing with the depressed patient, it wasn't about treating the slow speech directly. It was about addressing this underlying dynamic of control, the space in the conversation. It was being actively managed.
Wow, that's fascinating. And this all leads to Kishimi's example of Socrates, which I think is really powerful. He argues that Socrates was incredibly attuned to the atmosphere, to the mood of any situation he was in, but he consciously chose not to let it shut down the possibility for dialogue.
Yeah, and the context here is Socrates' trial and the moments leading up to his execution.
Yeah.
So even as he's facing death, he's engaged in this deep conversation with his friends about the immortality of the soul. And when he finishes speaking, there's this heavy silence. And some of his companions, they still have doubts, unanswered questions.
And Socrates' response is so telling. He actually encourages them to voice their unease. He prioritizes truth, understanding, over maintaining a comfortable atmosphere, even in his final hours. He gently nudges Simeon to articulate his hesitations, his objections.
And Phaedo, who wrote about Socrates, he highlights Socrates' empathy, his encouraging manner. It was such a unique and emotionally charged situation, right? Discussing the soul with a man about to die. But Socrates, even though he's so aware of the mood, the gravity of it all, he doesn't let it shut down the inquiry. He actively tries to understand why his friends are uneasy.
It's pretty incredible, and Kashimi uses this as a contrast to how most of us often behave. We tend to let the atmosphere dictate our actions, and we suppress our own dissenting thoughts, our questions, and we might later justify our silence by saying, oh, I was just being considerate of the atmosphere. But Kashimi's clear on this: we're ultimately responsible for the choices we make, even when we feel pressured.
And he points out how this atmosphere can be manipulated by those who are trying to persuade or even silence others. He brings up the COVID pandemic as a modern example and talks about how public pressure calls for self-restraint, even government-led naming and shaming of businesses that weren't complying. All these things contributed to an atmosphere of control. And this could actually distract from holding authorities accountable.
That's a really good point. Okay, so how do we resist this kind of pressure, this atmosphere? What does Kashimi suggest?
He gives some really practical advice. He says, if a question, a concern, is something that would benefit more than just yourself, then it should be voiced, regardless of the mood, regardless of time constraints.
So speak up, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Exactly. And he talks about the importance of teachers creating an environment where students feel safe asking questions, reassuring them that all questions are valuable. And journalists, they need to keep pushing with their questions, even when politicians try to shut them down or deflect. It takes courage to defy the atmosphere and do and say what you believe is right.
No doubt. And Kashimi then gets into why this culture of reading the air is so prevalent. He suggests it's not necessarily about lacking willpower, but rather this excessive concern with how others perceive us.
Yeah, it's this fear of social disapproval. And it's such a strong motivator for both silence and inaction. And he suggests that when we say, oh, I was just being considerate of the atmosphere, a lot of times it's actually masking a more self-serving motive. It's the path of least resistance,
And he brings us back to Socrates, who made this conscious decision not to cater to the atmosphere. Socrates put truth above everything, even persuasive rhetoric. He was even able to recognize his accusers' skill in persuasion while knowing that their charges against him were false.
And his refusal to use emotional appeals during his trial, like he specifically chose not to bring his children to court to try and sway the jury, that speaks volumes about his principles. He stayed true to his commitment to truth and justice, even when it meant defying the court and ultimately facing death.
It's really remarkable. And this leads to this core Socratic idea that Kashimi explores, which is that people always act in what they perceive to be their own best interest. It's that famous paradox, no one desires evil, which at first glance can sound kind of wrong, right?
It does, especially when we see actions that are clearly harmful. But Kashimi clarifies this by going back to the original Greek meanings of good and evil. Good didn't necessarily have a moral connotation. It meant more like beneficial or advantageous. And evil meant the opposite, unbeneficial or disadvantageous.
So it's more about self-interest than morality.
Right. So when we rephrase this statement, it becomes no one wants to do what they believe will ultimately be harmful or not beneficial to them. And that's kind of self-evident, isn't it? Even those who do things we consider wrong, they believe on some level that their actions will ultimately benefit them.
Okay, that makes sense.
And Socrates, he saw justice as the ultimate good, which explains why he refused to manipulate the court or compromise his principles. And Kashimi ties this back to our tendency to read the air, to conform. It's often based on a perceived benefit, right? Like avoiding conflict or gaining social approval. But he's challenging us to really think about whether those actions actually serve our long-term good.
So to bring it all together for you, the learner, Kashimi's really encouraging us to go beyond just passively accepting or simply adapting when we're faced with those unreasonable challenges that life throws our way. Real change, whether it's personal or societal, it often starts with that brave step of recognizing and saying, this isn't right. even when it feels hard or like it goes against the grain.
Exactly. And by understanding these dynamics, by understanding the difference between what we can't avoid and what we can potentially prevent, by recognizing our typical reactions to unfairness, and by seeing how those unspoken social pressures influence us, well, you can approach difficult situations with more awareness and a stronger sense of agency. It's about focusing your energy on what you can actually impact and not letting yourself get swept away by those feelings of inevitability or the fear of rocking the boat.
Absolutely. So here's a final thought for you to ponder. Think about a time when you felt that something wasn't quite right, but you went along with it anyway. What was the atmosphere like in that situation? What would it have taken for you to speak up? And how might Socrates' example, his unwavering commitment to his principles, even in the face of death, inform how you might approach similar situations in your own life? This deep dive into Kishimi's work, it really gives us a framework for recognizing and responding to the unreasonable with both courage and integrity.